Hello, public opinion aficionados, and welcome to Rasmussen Reports, where we're the only independent polling organization covering election fraud. And that's a pretty bold thing for us to talk about, since at the moment we have an active community strike on YouTube. But it's very important for us to talk about because we're essentially alone in acknowledging that the issue exists. And not only that, the horrible public trust problems that it creates. It's not a healthy thing in a democracy when 90% of likely voters are concerned about cheating in elections. And not only that, then to have the institutions, the politicians, and the mainstream media outright gaslight them to their face that everything is safe and secure, it's absolutely no wonder that trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Now, this is an old poll. We actually ran it back in December, and we didn't cover it at the time, but just recently, Justin Haskins of the Heartland Institute was on Tucker Carlson talking about it, and so it's blown up big. This poll was graciously sponsored by the Heartland Institute, and they've helped us run some real bangers in the past. Make sure you check out the one in January 2020, where we go into some of the insane lockdown measures that people were willing to do because of COVID, like taking unvaccinated people's children away. I'll link a great article that Justin wrote in the Federalist about this most recent poll, as well as the link to the clip that he did on the Tucker Carlson network. And I'll even put that COVID poll in the comments, so make sure you check that one out. But what did this poll say? According to voters, out of their own mouths, at least 18 million votes in the 2020 election were potentially fraudulent. And this isn't us researching or grasping at straws or drawing conclusions. We literally asked people if they cheated, and they said yes. So how did we get here? This is the first question. Did you vote with an absentee or mail-in ballot in the 2020 elections? 30% of voters said yes, 68% said no, and this is 1,085 U.S. likely voters. And those numbers are pretty reflective of actual voting behaviors in the 2020 election. The question two was, during the 2020 election, did a friend or family member fill out your ballot in part or in full on your behalf? Now, you might not know this, and our respondents weren't told this, but you're not allowed to do that. But 19% of voters said yes, and 79% said no. Question two, during the 2020 election, did you fill out a ballot in part or in full on behalf of a friend or family member, such as a spouse or child? Did you sign a ballot or ballot envelope on behalf of a friend or family member with or without his or her permission? 17% said yes, 81% said no. Again, not legal. But 21% of voters said yes, and 78% said no. During the 2020 election, did you cast a mail-in ballot in a state where you were no longer a permanent resident? That's really illegal. But 17% of our poll respondents said yes, and 82% said no. Now, you're starting to see a pattern of, 20% or high teens. But I can go back in and look at everybody who said yes to at least one of these questions. And here are the results. 28% of people who said they voted by mail-in ballot in the 2020 election committed out of their own mouths at least one form of voter fraud. 72% said no. There were 66 million mail-in ballots cast in the 2020 election. 28% of that number is over 18 million people. So 18 million, at least 18 million people, according to this poll, cast a fraudulent ballot in that election. That equates to over 12% of all ballots cast in 2020. And if you recall, the margin was just over 4%. But here's the real scary thing. This is potentially just the lower bound. These people could have voted multiple times and they still would have responded just yes or no. And there are plenty of other forms of fraud that could have impacted the election. But according to their own words, who cheated most? It's pretty interesting to see. Men and women were about equal, and Republicans and Democrats cheated about the same as well. But look at age and race. Only 16% of white voters said they had at least one form of fraud, of the four that we gave them the option to select. But 42% of black voters, 51% of Hispanic voters, and 30% of Asian and other race voters admitted to at least one form of fraud. But look at 18 to 39-year-olds. There is something wrong with this picture. 46% of them admitted to at least one form of fraud. But it was only 20% for middle-aged voters and 8% for voters over 65. But if you're looking at those party numbers and saying, hold up, no way, there's no way that Republicans and Democrats, according to their own words, cheated the same amount. What this poll can't capture for, again, is if respondents cheated more than once. So in my opinion, there are some horrifying things in this poll. Of course, there's the level of fraud, admitted fraud, in younger voters and minority groups that we have no reason to think might possibly abate. But then there's the fact that at least 12% of all ballots cast in the 2020 election, according to just these 4 questions, were fraudulent when that election was decided by, really, when it comes down to it, less than 0.5% of all of the votes cast. We're not going to stop polling on this topic because, in our opinions, it's one of the most important. There is a crisis of trust in public institutions, and I think election integrity is at the core of it. And that's what our polling has found over and over again, with things like the fact that 56% of the electorate thinks that cheating will affect this upcoming election, 2024, and only 16% of them say it's not at all likely. 51% say that mail-in voting just makes it easier to cheat, and only 15% say harder. Then there's the fact that actually now 52%, a pretty good majority of voters, think that it's likely that U.S. intel agencies are intent on influencing the outcome of this upcoming election. And then, of course, there's our bread and butter election fraud polling, where overwhelming majorities of Americans approve of common sense things like voter IDs and paper ballots and in-person voting, audits and stuff like that. But as pretty much the only pollsters who even acknowledge this issue, I can tell you that overwhelmingly, Americans are not happy with the status quo, and the solution of gaslighting by those in power is not the right way to address it. If you think that this is the biggest issue we're covering, make sure you post your thoughts in the comments at YouTube or Rumble. Like the video while you're there, and please subscribe. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Rasmussen_poll, where we actually go into primary source material on investigations into election fraud. We're one of the only places you're going to see that stuff. Thanks for watching.